Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to welcome you here this evening. I think we have a little over 500 registrations for our event today, and I'm just really delighted to see so many people, or to see in the virtual sense. My name is Paul Bramadat. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. I'm really pleased to welcome you to what is really the final lecture of our regular CSRS lecture series, which happens every Thursday night. And this is the final series of 2020. Or final lecture of 2020. We begin our new series in January. As well, I'd like to welcome you all to the first of 5 John Albert Hall events, which begin now and wrap up at the end of March. The John Albert Hall lecture series has taken a variety of forms over the last 15 years and is the fruit of a long and productive collaboration between the CSRS and the Anglican Diocese of British Columbia. In a moment, the very Reverend Ansley Tucker, the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral in Victoria, will bring the greetings of the Anglican community. Now, the 5 John Albert Hall lectures between now and March give us a chance to pause and reflect critically on many fundamental features of our shared life on which we might now finally make some meaningful progress. Each lecture and discussion will have its own emphases, of course, reflecting the backgrounds and interests of the scholars, activists, and artists we have assembled, including, by the way, Noam Chomsky, Miroslav Volf, Linda Woodhead, Thomas Homer Dixon, and Edugyan. Now, by way of noting one of the issues I think will likely emerge in our conversations, and one of the features of Canadian life that is most in need of serious soul searching, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now, to bring the greetings of the Anglican community, I'd like to welcome Ansley Tucker.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Ansley Tucker, and I am the Dean of the Diocese of British Columbia, these islands and inlets all around Vancouver Island, and I'm really pleased to bring you greetings. We believe it is both a privilege and our duty, there's an old-fashioned word for you, to bring faith and intellect into conversation with each other. Or as the ancients would have said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Or as we might say in our own time, what has religion to do with sociology or faith with science? And the answer, we would say, is everything, absolutely everything. One without the other is but a fraction of its own wholeness. And this is why we are so pleased to make a contribution from the John Albert Hall Trust and to work so closely with the Center for the Study of Religion and Society to bring these John Albert Hall lectures to Victoria. Paul is going to be introducing today's speakers in a few moments, so let me say only this, that Edugyan and Tim Lilith are compelling witnesses in a time of upheaval and systemic ructions. They are compelling witnesses of the power of the pen. They remind us, should we have forgotten, and I often fear we have, that sound bites titillate, but they do not fulfill. And that the rush to deadline deprives us of deep, complex thought and analysis. This we need, and this they offer. So I want to thank them and you for being here today. Paul.
Thanks very much, Ansley. And now I have the great privilege of introducing you to 2 of Canada's finest writers. I'll keep my comments brief because you'll come to know both of these artists throughout their conversation today and in our broader discussion period. Edugyan is an internationally acclaimed writer and alumna of the University of Victoria, perhaps best known for her novels Half-Blood Blues and Washington Black, both of which won the Giller Prize. Now, to win the prestigious prize twice is an honor she shares with Alice Munro and M.G. Vasanji. In 2014, she published Dreaming of Elsewhere, Observations on Home, a literary reflection on belonging, origins, and movement. She's held fellowships in the US, Scotland, Iceland, Germany, Hungary, Finland, Spain, Canada, and Belgium. We're tremendously fortunate to have her with us here today and to be able to eavesdrop on the conversation she will have with my colleague at UVic, Dr. Tim Lilburn. Tim is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the first Canadian ever to win the Homer Prize, the European Medal of Poetry and Art. He is the author of 11 books of poetry, including Kill Sight, To the River, Moosewood Sandhills, Assiniboia, and Orphic Politics. He's been nominated for the Governor General's Award in Literature twice, and in 2003, he won the award for Kill Sight. His most recent book of poetry is The House of Charlemagne. In 2019, Tim was a faculty fellow at the CSRS, but in fact, he has been a member of our intellectual and social community for well over a decade. My experience with Tim's subtle imagination made him the obvious interlocutor for Essie this evening. Now, before I turn the digital podium over to Essie and Tim, I should let you know that we are using an enhanced Zoom platform that might be new to some of you. What this means in practice is that you're welcome to pose questions in the Q&A section of your screen, and then I will convey these questions to Essie and Tim later. Since we have about 500 people with us, we can't have quite the same level of open engagement as we are now used to with Zoom. We will turn off the chat function of Zoom while they are engaged in their conversation so we can all concentrate on their reflections. Once the Q&A period has begun, we will open up the chat function and you can respond to one another in the way you've become accustomed to on Zoom. For those of you who want to revisit the reflections you hear tonight, please know that we will record and make the event available to the public by sometime next week. And now, without further ado, Essie and Tim, take it away.
Essie, it is so good to see you. Usually we meet your family and me in Monrose, but I haven't been in Monrose for almost a year, getting on a year.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah, so it's good to see you.
It's really lovely to see you too.
So we all know that we're in a period of tremendous change. The pandemic, rising authoritarianisms, and problems that predate this year: systemic racism, climate change, the imperative to seek reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. How do you read yourself this historical moment?
I mean, it's obviously a time of great social and environmental disruption. I mean, it's all three of the novels that I've written have dealt with turbulent times, and they were written in times of great calm for me, relatively speaking to the material. And so it's been really, I guess, fascinating on some level to be living during this pandemic and trying to process that and really trying to grapple with things. So many of our certainties have been rattled, right? We had faith that our global alliances were, not unshakable or unshaken, because of course we've been through Brexit and the advent of the Trump presidency and all of this. But it does feel like with the pandemic, something like our core faith maybe in the certainty that we will always be here. We will solve the problems of climate change, and we will continue to proliferate and but these are all things that are sort of feeling, I guess our core humanity feels like it's something that's under threat in a corporeal way, but also with our values. In terms of this being a period of great change, I think obviously we are going through so many changes, but in terms of it fundamentally altering our core values, I think that's something that remains to be seen. I think that's something that's still playing out. I think change is something that is incremental. Sometimes, or sometimes something that happens very quickly, but then you have a kind of a backstep that occurs. to think of an example of this, I think 2015 was a pretty painful year in terms of us watching videos of police brutality and I guess, police executions. But, it's only in 2020 that we're having these very, very serious, challenging, potentially value-altering conversations about policing. But then again, reading the news the other day and just looking at this bill that's being discussed in France that would make it illegal to film police officers. Wow. I mean, that to me seems like it's quite shocking. It's a huge step backwards if this bill gets passed. It's, in so many of these cases, the videos by passerby are really the only proof that we have that aside from the word of the police that these things actually occurred. So I think that would be just like a shocking development and a trespass against personal freedoms. But I think these are some of the things that, or some of the ways that change works. It's constantly, a push forward, a step backwards. But I think maybe overall, hopefully we get to a better place.
Some people think that the shock of this particular new is going to drive us toward fundamentally changing our values and assumptions. Do you believe that this is the case? Do you think that we are proceeding into a time of great internal change, attitudinal change?
I think it's a real opportunity for that. As I was saying, I think so many of the things that we've taken for granted, we're realizing that these are things that can be destroyed, and they can be destroyed at a moment's notice. And, what we do with that new knowledge is really, it remains to be seen whether this creates, a better world. It's, change is, it's just something that it's unpredictable where things end up, but you just hope that, in the grand arc of things that, that we are fundamentally swimming towards a world that is better for all in terms of protections of all of our rights and also protection of the environment. A move away from fossil fuels, a move away from, degradation of animal habitats. These are some of the things that we need to really be looking at and questioning. I mean, I live about a 2-minute walk from a bird sanctuary, which, I'm so grateful for that. But I was just reading an article the other day that was saying something like 70% of seabirds have been rendered extinct in the last 50 years, which is kind of a shocking number, something I wasn't aware of. And, things are really precarious and they're growing ever more so. And this could be a time where we really, really, don't allow that kind of sort of backward stepping, that we really commit to following through on changing so many of these things that have been made clear to us in the last little while.
Yes, I think that all of us feel this precarity and feel the fragility of things, of states of mind. Marx said, "All that is solid melts into air," and it feels like we're in this kind of melting or atomizing state. Meanwhile, the expectation is that we will step up morally and dispositionally and alter our attitudes to various things. Do you think that literature or writing, how do you think literature and writing can help during these turbulent times?
I think the role that literature plays is the role that it has always played, and it's the role that it will, I think, continue to play, which is just to delineate in a very honest and authentic way the lives of very specific people, and give us a sense of somebody else's reality. Now, sometimes that has led to changes in law. If we think of the novels of Charles Dickens as being part of what changed child labor law, for instance, in England. And also, something like the obscenity trials over D.H. Lawrence's novels, how that, the triumph, I guess the fact that the courts had deemed it, okay for his books to be read, this put them in the hands of so many new readers who maybe wouldn't have read his work otherwise. And really, a book like Lady Chatterley's Lover, I think really expanded the discourse about human sexuality, and also kind of codified what it was okay to write about and to speak about in public. And, that's an enormous change. That's something that shifts a person's view of sexuality in general. And, these were changes that the authors could never have predicted when they sat down to write these books. You don't write a book with the intent of changing a law, but you do write a book with the intention of creating fully realized people, and maybe by people reading about those lives, what you're doing is you're shifting their perceptions about other people's lives and about what's possible for their own lives. And so I think that, that is the work that literature can do, is in shifting those perceptions. And I think just as a small example of this, Tim, I remember I was traveling out in Halifax. I had an event there, and I was speaking with the events organizer, and he had just finished reading a children's book to his son. And one of the scenes in the book it sort of depicted a Black family going blackberry picking in the summer. And he was really struck by that scene because for some reason, he said he didn't know why, but he had never associated blackberry picking with Black people. He just didn't somehow assume that that's something that they did. And blackberry picking was a feature of his childhood. It was something that he did very often. And so by him by him reading that book and kind of linking the experiences, and, he really kind of was able to sort of bridge this gulf between his own childhood experiences and those of maybe a Black child who's his contemporary growing up in a neighborhood, several miles away. It was this kind of connection for him. And I thought that was very interesting.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking too of how books can alter people and even alter the course of history. I'm thinking of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and how this contributed to the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal. Is writing a visionary activity, do you think? Can it be? Should it be? Should writers now be imagining for folks who are disoriented and acutely feel the fragility of everything, some kind of larger future, some previously unrecognized thing?
Writing is an art, like any other art, and I think I would never sort of have a prescription on what another artist should tackle. Is writing a visionary act? I think it's visionary in the sense that it it's something that looks very honestly at the human experience. And that in and of itself is a visionary act. In terms of writing that's projecting a future or sort of I don't think that, I think that there are writers who will always want to write about, where their project really is to have a kind of sort of visionary projection of the future. I'm thinking of Margaret Atwood's environmental trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy,
Right.
And that's been part of her project. But I think, just the act of sitting down to write, to create something is in itself visionary, because it, you're really saying this is something, there will be a future. There will be a future in which this piece is read. And that's an act of faith.
Essie, I know from email exchanges and conversations with you, I know that you have thoughts on policing in the era we are now entering. And you also have thoughts on urban planning and how we might re-envision our neighborhoods. Would you like to share these thoughts, policing and urban planning?
Sure. I mean, I did touch on policing earlier. Just, I'm so interested in this new bill and seeing how things play out, just because it seems to me so patently wrong. So that's something I've been thinking about. In the spring, where I was writing a lot of pieces about, Black Lives Matter and policing, I think one of the things that I maybe was thinking about was this idea that, maybe we shouldn't expect the police to be able to deal with every sort of situation. The training, I don't know the particulars of the training, but it just seems to me that it might be better off to have a kind of task force set up in which you have a social worker or, somebody who, if somebody's in the midst of a mental health crisis, then you can send a group who's, in which a member of that group is trained to deal with somebody who's in a bad state or, who's overdosing on drugs. That these are things that can maybe be dealt with in a different way. And, I think that's something that our city has done or is looking at, as far as I recall, which I thought was really, really amazing and heartening. And I've been following that. In terms of urban planning, I don't know about you, Tim, but that's one of the things that has really struck me during this time at home is, I live out in the suburbs. And we have a really lovely street, but I rarely see a human being wandering down it. I see more deer than people. And during this time where we're supposed to kind of stay local and keep close to home, and when we were allowed our kind of safe 6 people to socialize with, you really got the feeling that there was this kind of lack of community, a real sense that, when you saw people, it was really lovely, but you didn't really see them very often. And it occurred to me that, the suburbs could be sort of re-envisioned in a way that, that would sort of make human connections more possible. After the Second World War, Europe, they rebuilt their cities, keeping, sort of sense of community and public housing in mind. And North American cities post-World War II have all sort of seemed to have been built around the car and around the suburb, and in creating space, creating privacy through space. But I think that a lot of connections, at least from my perspective, have gotten lost in that project. There are things that you've sacrificed social connection for privacy. And, I very much value privacy, but, I really feel like that's maybe not, it doesn't have to be sort of one thing or the other. I was thinking it would be so lovely if in our community we had a sort of gathering place, a meeting place, a kind of little square. And I was thinking maybe sort of all suburban neighborhoods could have this square, which is a combination of kind of commercial space, like a little coffee house or a restaurant where you can meet, coupled with green space for people to enjoy. And one of the things that's been so lovely about well, maybe lovely is not the right word, but I guess a silver lining that has emerged with all of this, terrible, all of these terrible things that we're having to confront is, people seem to really be enjoying spaces that were once reserved for the car. We've shut down streets, we have outdoor dining, restaurants have sort of spilled out into the streets at some point. I know you haven't been down to Monroe's for a year, but they had closed off. They'd closed off government. It was just pedestrian-only traffic. And while I understand that was a bit of a complicated thing for some businesses, it was such a relief and such a pleasure to be able to wander through those spaces without sort of, I have young children, so there's always the fear of one of them getting struck by a car, but the temperature of everything just got a little bit lowered and you felt very relaxed and comfortable. And I'm somebody who spent a lot of time living on and off in Europe, mostly in Stuttgart in the south of Germany. But one of the things that I was struck by as I sort of, went all about and was traveling a lot was this emphasis on green space and on city squares, and you could go to even sort of some neighborhoods that were maybe you consider more suburban, and they also had their little meeting places, and that's something that that maybe we could think about in terms of if we ever get to sort of restructure our neighborhoods, just a place where people can really come together. And, even to talk about housing in those terms is a privilege, right? Because there are so many people who lack for housing. And this is something that has really been emphasized during this pandemic. You've seen people really searching for a place to go and sort of these large tent cities emerging in parks, and there being not a lot of patience for that, even though, there haven't really been sort of, I guess, maybe we're eking our way towards solutions. But, I was really heartened to see when the city was buying up older hotels in order to house some people who didn't have housing. Those are initiatives that I think are really great and sound, and maybe we need more of that. The other thing I was thinking about was, I had to homeschool my children from March to I guess right up until September. We were doing our learning, and it would have been impossible to do, obviously, without a Wi-Fi connection. And that's something I take for granted. It's just a very simple thing that's always in my home. But, if you don't have the income for that, or you are sort of having issues with housing, I mean, this was a case where your child was simply going to slip through the cracks. So perhaps there could be initiatives where, a free Wi-Fi would be part of the offering with low-income housing. That this is something that maybe is made more sort of democratic in terms of its offerings. Now, I know that brings up other issues in terms of access to computers and all of this, but I think universal Wi-Fi is maybe one of the first steps.
Okay, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot.
Oh,
well, I mean, Washington Black is an amazing novel. And for me, the most amazing part of it is the degree of empathy that is in it. You take us into the mind and the emotions and the suffering of a young slave on a vicious plantation in the Barbados, and you make us feel the warmth of his body. We feel ourselves very close to Wash. It was truly an amazing achievement. That novel was very buoying for me. I read it just as the pandemic was starting, and I was just carried along with it. Here's the putting you on the spot. Could you imagine your way into the mind and the emotions of a character 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What would they see? What would they want? What would they fear? Essentially, I'm asking you to do a sketch of a novel.
To make a visionary projection.
Yeah.
I've always said that, I'm somebody who, with all of my novels, is sort of writing, more deeply and deeply historical novels. I keep going backwards. But it's been so hard to sort of grapple with the present that I couldn't imagine grappling with the future. But, I think that character would want to see a world that is changed. A world that, so when you talk about what would their fear be, their fear would be stasis. Their fear would be that the world looked exactly as it does now. I think that would be the central fear. But, I think that character would want to see a world in which we have actually made some forward movement. I don't know if many people have watched this, but I was privileged enough to be sitting in the audience when the great poet Patrick Lane gave his commencement speech at the University of Victoria, which was probably about maybe over 10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and there was this just really memorable line about his generation having, I guess, just devastated the landscape. They'd eaten all of the trees, and they had drunk up all of the rivers and the oceans, all the earth's waters. And, it was just such a striking image and so apt. And, I think maybe with my generation, there was there has been sort of more awareness, but I really think that it's the generations sort of behind mine that are the most engaged with this, because they bear the greatest brunt, right? This is something this is the world that we've all bequeathed them, but it's not their job to fix everything. It's everybody's job to do this. And so I really think we need to reckon with so many things, just the way that we've completely degraded or degraded animal habitats, just the way that we've sort of continued to invest in fossil fuels. All of these things are things that we need to reckon with and try and change. I know that on a small scale in our households, the big thing that we were working on, or we've been working on for the last few months, is trying to combat food waste. This is a big thing in our house. We had so many, it just seemed like we were so wasteful in terms of what we were throwing out each week. And so we've made a really concerted effort to to cook smaller meals, to eat leftovers, to not be purchasing as many groceries as we had in the past, and really encouraging the children to make an effort as well. And we've made a difference, but that's something that's very small, but it's something you can do, right? Because so often I think change feels, if you say you sort of have to fix the environment, or whatever, that's an overwhelming thing. It seems a little bit abstract, but small incremental changes, I think, can eventually amount to something seismic. So those are the kinds of things that I would be thinking about, and this fear of stasis, of staying in the same place. Right. That would be something that maybe this character would find unconscionable.
I think in a kind of dire way, we have no opportunity, no chance of staying in the same place. I mean, there are going to be climate upheavals. This is just a given. And with those upheavals, there will be political strains. We've had a foretaste of this for the last 4 years. I mean, politically terrifying things that one would never have expected happening. What spiritual and cultural resources do you think people are going to need as we live into this time of accelerating accelerating climate disruption and the accompanying political strains? Like what are the resources, spiritual and cultural, do you think individuals will need?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to vary from person to person, what it is that people feel that they most need to get through a time of strife or an era of strife, really. I would say that for my father, this would be the church. He is so connected to his faith and to his church. And in fact, it's been, really difficult for him these last few months to not have those connections. I mean, his whole social network seems to be attached to his church. And so, I think he's trying to find ways to connect with the congregation and all of the friends that he's made. But that's, he is taking solace from those connections. And I think that's kind of what will pull him through. For me, it's been literature. I've taken so much solace from reading poetry these last few months. And I know a lot of people who have turned or returned to the classics. And, they're reading books that maybe have sat dustily on their shelves for, like 30 years. And they're pulling them out and they're reading them, and they're getting some measure of consolation from them. And I think one of the things that the classics can do is they show us that every era has had its troubles and its trials and its tribulations, and that these were, that we're not sort of alone in going through upheaval. But they also kind of tell us that these things were sort of gotten past in a way. And so, so I think they offer the consolation of that as well, that there is the possibility to live beyond this, to live beyond what is, what feels in the moment so fraught and maybe even unendurable and potentially unchangeable.
If you, do you think that you mentioned your father and his attachment to his church? Do you think there is a role for the churches in walking with people into this time of strain, dislocation, and maybe dissolution. I mean, if the churches were to come to you, or if you were, the church were, and say, what should we do? What would you offer them? What would you ask of them?
Maybe it's sort of best to view this through my father's eyes, because he's so connected to his church. Just maybe somebody to help him kind of sort through some of the complicated feelings he's having, so maybe questions of faith in the face of essentially a plague, right? Of course, you're going to be asking all sorts of questions about human existence and about why this occurred. If this is your faith, these are some of the things that are coming up. And so I think some kind of counsel and guidance would be something that he's looking for. But also, if I think about, when I was a child and attending church, one of the essential things that churches seemed to do in that time was to sort of go out into the community and do sort of very kind of concrete acts of trying to help the community. So having, for instance, having the chance to feed people, these kinds of things, which of course during a pandemic, that's something that's not possible. But just this role of being at the heart of a community for people who who have deep faith, and just a sense of that institution or that resource or that house of worship is still there, and it's still there to be of support. Although the ways that it can be there are temporarily different, it's still there. It still exists.
So one final question from me, and I know you've covered a lot of this already, so don't hesitate to repeat yourself. Okay. What is the new possible for us?
What is the new possible? Wow, that's such a big question. I think the new possible is essentially to accept on a grand scale that things will change and have already changed, but that we need to sort of now react in the moment rather than sort of waiting for everything to blow over and then resuming our roles and resuming the way that we've always done things. I think the new possible is the potential to completely throw out systems that have been failing us recently. Obviously, there are certain, for instance, aspects of policing that can be completely I guess maybe not completely, but just sort of questioned and probed, and for actual change to come out of this. I think this is a time where there's a great potential for so many different kinds of change, and that's that should be exciting, right? That should be something that's obviously frightening, but exciting. So I think that's the new possible, is to embrace this idea that things can be done differently.
Well, thank you very much, Jessie. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
It was very good talking to you, and I enjoyed the process of back and forth as we put this together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we're going to open up for general questions.
Yes, I just need to put my video on, Scott. So now, folks, thanks very much, Tim and Essie. That was just a great conversation. I really appreciate the honesty and the sort of poignant grappling with these issues. Now, I would say to the people who have joined us, the audience members, please type your question into the Q&A section that you all have on the bottom of your screen. And Rachel Brown and I will kind of moderate that. And but I thought that actually maybe a way to begin the Q&A period would be to kind of pose a question myself that links, I think, to this question of the new possible and something Essie recently mentioned, which is that you began to return yourself to some of the literary classics when the pandemic began. So I did the same thing. And of course, like many people, the first book I read was Albert Camus' The Plague, which I'd read many times as a 20, 30, and 40-year-old, because it's such a beautiful piece of literature. And I wonder, it brought me into the ways that everyday people in his novel responded to the pandemic, to alienation, to chaos, to absurdity, and to the loss of meaning in his town in Algeria. And I wonder what kind of solace is available now that wasn't available or imaginable then, or another way to put it would be what kind of sense of dread and despair would Camus not have been able to imagine that we can imagine better now? In other words, when you think about his piece written when it was written in the 40s, and it was written against a very, very different backdrop than we have. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have a certain kind of cosmopolitanism didn't exist. They weren't grappling quite so much with the post-colonial moment. So they didn't have inclusive language. So there are all kinds of different things in his period. And I wonder what kinds of, as it were, spiritual or existential kinds of concerns wouldn't have been able to be articulated so well then that we can now see now when we read it. Because when I read the book again, it felt again, in some sense, that it was perfectly appropriate to our moment, and also that it was really definitely from another time.
Right. I'd be curious to know the specifics of what made it feel like it was from another time. Like
they had a sense of the outside world and the way in which they were cut off from the outside world in a way in which this particular moment, in some sense, underlines our connectedness to the outside world, because the whole world is working on the vaccine, for example. Right. So there's that sense in which you become ultra local and you're locked down in your house, and the way in which you begin to sense yourself as being part of a broader human community.
Yeah, and I think, in the 21st century, we have this current moment has sort of maybe made certain people question this, but we have such faith in science, right? And science is something that can potentially save us. And in this case, it looks like that's probably coming through. I mean, to be able to develop a vaccine in less than a year, this is an unheard of speed. And that question of the vaccine has been something that has always been lingering from the very outset of this pandemic. And so I feel like the prospect of that has maybe been one of the things that's alleviated this sense of I guess, long, existential dread that plays out over a long period of time. It's always been something that we've been able to hang on to throughout all of this, and it's something that we continue to hang on to. I mean, obviously, hasn't arrived yet, but it's been the thing that's obviously going to be one of the things that saves us. But I like this idea that you're talking about the connectivity versus the kind of sense of disconnectedness that Camus was writing about, because I think that is one of the chief features of what we've been going through, is that there's been so much discussion about this online. I mean, you can sort of by the minute get an update about where we are, certainly a daily update. And so that has maybe, I don't know if that's caused some people more dread, being able to sort of track this thing with, sort of how many knowing exactly how many cases a day there have been and all of this. Maybe that's something that's more caused some people more fear. But I think for a lot of people, it's sort of made things feel like they're a little bit more under control than maybe they are. We have something quantifiable. Again, it's that faith in science, right? We have something quantifiable that tells us these things. And because this exists, it makes it possible for us to have some measure of control, maybe over what's going on. And, perhaps at times that's been illusory, but it's been something that's, I think, been helpful for some people and helped us stave off a sense of utter dread.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about your father and how important the church is to his sense of how to respond to these kinds of calamities is that in Camus' period, when we're thinking about the 40s, that sort of, in some sense, pre-secularization, right? So that the ambient presence of some kind of capital R religious entity to provide an explanation for what's happening to you in your life and why there are so many dead people and, that there is a God and there is still meaning. The ambient sense of that as a possibility was much more powerful, I think, than it is today. Although that's not to say that people still aren't finding meaning in capital R religious institutions, but the way in which in the 40s, it was part of the shared imaginary, whereas now it's somewhat more fractured or threatened as a reliable sense of the imaginary, kind of a net to catch everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And it's almost like some of that, has been sort of transferred over into scientific institutions or something. This is where that sort of level of, for some people, that level of faith has sort of migrated to.
Yeah, thank you. So now some of the other people asking questions. Hang on. Abigail Olarte asks, you speak about shifting perceptions. What's your take on the role of literature in dismantling systemic racism that is so deeply embedded in Canadian institutions? Could you point to books written by BIPOC authors that we should look at as models as we reimagine a future, one that's free of racism? Also, based on your experiences, what are the inequities that BIPOC authors face?
That's a good question. That's something that I know I've been having a lot of discussions about, both with Black writers, but also sort of with people working within publishing houses. That there's this question of a lack of visibility, both in the actual published work, but also in the lack of diversity in the staffing in publishing houses. And I think that's really sort of the answer, is to create a more diverse sort of set of editors, publishers, all of this. And that this will go some way towards addressing, I guess, a lack of visibility of BIPOC authors in terms of what's getting published. What books can I direct people towards? I think Desmond Cole's The Skin We're In. I think that this is a book that so interesting, so important. I think mainly one of the things that it did for me is I've been reading a lot about the Black experience, back in March, but so many of my touchstones were American, and he really sort of delineates these Canadian stories of police brutality and of racism and institutional racism, and you just, I wasn't sort of maybe as familiar with certain victims of police brutality in Toronto, as I'd been. You get names like Michael Brown and Breonna Taylor. We know these names, but it was sort of I guess, eye-opening to me in terms of my homegrown communities, of what exactly was going on out east, especially, because I don't know, I'm not always connected to that. So his is a book that I would highly recommend. Sorry, I'm just thinking, I feel like there's a part of that question that I'm not addressing that I've stepped over, and I don't want to sidestep anything. So
No. Yeah, what's your take on the role of literature in dismantling systemic racism that's so deeply embedded in our institutions?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's what I touched on before when I was talking to Tim, this idea of the literature's ability to really, really get at the core psyche of a character, to show us what a person is thinking and feeling, and we're passing through every experience with this character, and we get to know him very intimately and deeply, or her or they. And that, to me, is that idea of knowing somebody whose experience might be, so wildly different from what you go through in your life, or whose experience is very similar, but that closeness maybe to somebody who inhabits a completely different body. That, to me, goes a long way towards dismantling people's maybe prejudices or misconceptions about people of other races. This idea of seeing where you have some commonality with somebody unlike yourself, seeing where things differ, understanding that there are things that you will never experience, and seeing how they play out for this particular character. These are things that really start to break down barriers, I guess, for lack of a better term. That reading experience that I was talking about earlier, where the man had read this book about Black people picking blackberries, and that hadn't occurred to him, and he could see a commonality. Like it's such a small thing, but it seemed completely eye-opening for him, and it seemed to shift something for him. And so I sort of, took that away from his story, that it had sort of brought him, or shifted his idea of what he thought Blackness, was. And so these are the things that literature can do. Just changes your way of thinking.
There's a good link to this next question. This is from Dana Lay. And this, in some sense, is a question about philosophy and postmodernism, in a sense, without using those terms. She asks, as a writer, do you feel like we're living in a fractured existence right now? I wonder how we can, through literature, find a way to create a universal grand narrative that unites people somehow, because I feel that is key to any kind of new possible.
Are we living in a fractured existence? Collectively? A fractured existence?
Yeah.
I guess maybe I would say that certainly, like, I'm in my early 40s. And so one of the things that I've noticed is how much more sort of polarized everybody is, and how much more sort of maybe entrenched within, how shall I put it? I'm trying to think of exactly the right words, but there's the idea of other voices and not speaking for others, and not writing outside of one's perspective. And I think fundamentally, in general, I agree with that. I agree that there are certain experiences that or certain histories that do belong to some groups, and are perhaps sort of maybe, it's a contentious thing to explore somebody else's history. Having said that, I really chafe at this idea that somebody who doesn't fully inhabit exactly the lived experience of their character can't write about that character. And that's something that has always seemed to me to be problematic. Especially, I mean, I'm somebody who's written 3 novels from the perspective of men, Black men, all various ages. And, that's not necessarily my lived reality, right? That isn't my lived reality. I'm a Black woman going through the world as a Black woman. So this idea that, that people aren't sort of allowed to step outside of certain experiences to express other realities, that's a very difficult thing. Obviously, it's something that the idea of appropriating voices is it's a very real issue, and it comes out of very real historical grievances. I mean, the way that I can speak, that Black characters have been portrayed in certain novels has been really, just looking at thinking of certain 19th century examples, you sort of are left shaking. Like, this is not something that should have been attempted, maybe, as to try and write this. But, I think when somebody has an angle of approach that feels authentic and, that not to say that they should just be able to write what they want, but that I think this sort of just saying in a blanket kind of way that this should not be allowed is something I really have issues with. And I don't know who gets to be the arbiter or who gets to be the judge of what is passable. It's such a difficult issue to speak about, but it's certainly something that I think we need to keep talking about.
Thanks. And we have Tim Lilburn back on screen, so you can possibly engage this next question as well as Essie, because it actually comes from a mutual friend of ours, John Tatamano, who asks, what has been is the way things will always be. And he says that's really how he would sum up what it means to be bereft of imagination. If that's so, then imagination surely must be about contesting that sense of being stuck and fated to things as they are and have always been. So it feels like imagination is critical now, perhaps more than ever, but I still don't know what imagination is. It still feels like we speak too poorly about it as flights of fancy, for example, or wishful thinking. I'd love to hear both of our authors reflect on I'd love to hear what both of our authors have to say about my feeling that imagination is a much bigger thing, even religiously, than we take it to be. Maybe we need to reimagine imagination.
What do you think, Tim?
I'll let either of you handle that.
I think of a book that pretty well disappeared. I mean, it exists in fragments, still in the original French. It's Louis Riel's book, Masnahiken, which he wrote. It's a book written in exile. He was living in Montana in flight from the Canadian Army, essentially. The title in Cree means complete account or full story. So he imagines like a completely new cosmology and a completely new way of the world being the world and being in that world. This is an act of great political imagination. And I mean, that vision, Riel's vision, articulated in Masnahiken, continues to animate, like years and years after this. So imagination isn't fancy. It's not inconsequential epistemologically or politically. Or I think of the work of Blake, or the work of Walt Whitman, or the work of the great Nigerian poet Christopher Akigbo. Like, he imagines this new way be now that draws the past into it, like his village past and the religion of his village. So yeah, I do think we need a revitalized sense of what imagination can do. I think that in terms of, I think our political imagination is frankly too timid. I think we should let it exercise full reach. Yeah.
Unless it's really ugly.
Unless it's really ugly.
as we see it's just south of us. Right? So political imagination in its grotesque qualities.
I'm not seeing imagination there. I'm seeing hate, and there's no imagination in that. That's a refusal of imagination. No, I mean, I think of poets, American poets like Roberto Harrison, who has imagined this political and dispositional state that he calls being the tech from Tecumseh. And he imagines these political groupings forming out of various people being the tech, called tech alliances. And he imagines these things, these forms of floating solidarity as being operative now. It's on. It's going on. It's happening now. Or a poet like amazing Chicago poet Peter O'Leary, just discovered in the last year. He completely reimagines the notion of apocalypse as revelation. So it's like his imagination is partly biblical, but it's also Neoplatonic, and it's. Yeah, I think, man, I'd march to that drum. I mean, that just has me so animated, and Riel's vision. So I do think this is one thing that literature can offer, like these kind of large metaphysical, visionary possibilities. It can be very therapeutic.
I'm curious to know what specifically in Riel's book did you take away from it that made you feel like this was something that?
It's a very unusual book. He's trying to do a kind of science in it, and he speaks of I think just the sweep of it, just the huge sweep of it, and the sense of possibility and equality in it. Yeah, it's very peculiar, but it's also extraordinary. I tried to write about this in this. I was commissioned to do a wordscape for a dance performance by New Dance Horizons. In the book, The House of Charlemagne.
Essie, do you have any reflections on imagination?
Just this idea that the person posing the question said about, it having sort of the word having been sort of co-opted to mean something very fanciful. And I think, as a writer, imagination is really about conceiving the possible. And this can be a possible past, like a re-envisioning of the past, or just envisioning somebody's the possible, the possibility of all of their choices. But it's envisioning what's possible, but in a very concrete way, which I think dismisses the fanciful. I think that imagination fails without that aspect of the concrete to anchor it.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue to Elena Namanadou's question. And she asks, can you talk about the concept of truth? You've talked about faith, religion, science, and faith in science, which to all are very much connected to a strong notion of truth. At the same time, in our age, we are in a period where truth is a fragile thing. We're in the age of post-truth and alternate facts. What is the role of literature in conveying truth? I'm thinking here about Salman Rushdie's Haroun and the Sea of Stories. The main character asks his father, what is the point of stories if they aren't even true? Can you comment on literature and truth in relation to the topic of today's event and where our societies are at these days?
Do you want to start, Tim, or?
I think this is your question.
Okay. I think literature, the job of literature, or the role of literature, not to say it has a job, or even say the role is maybe kind of pinning it down too much, but for me, at least, part of what I'm trying to do when I sit down to write is to present, I guess, the truth of one life. And by saying that, that's to convey a fully formed, fully realized person. That's the attempt anyway. In all of their contradictions and with all of their varying and contradicting desires and with all of their prejudices fully on view. And that ends up being a kind of truth, but it's about that particular person. But in showing that one life, I think there's a sense of connection that we can feel. We can kind of see ourselves in that person, and also maybe not see ourselves in that person, and see how much what they're thinking and living through diverges from what we're experiencing, which is an experience that we have when we read historical fiction, I think, and sometimes reading the thoughts of very sort of narrow-minded or prejudiced characters. It gives us a sense of how far we've come from that place, or maybe how little we've come from that level of thinking. So these are all things that that literature is trying to do, is to present one truth. In terms of alternative facts and all of that, fiction is a kind of alternative universe that's trafficking in truths that maybe didn't play out the way you're writing about them, but it is essentially true if it has depicted people as complex beings, I think. What do you think, Tim?
I agree entirely with you on this. Now, when I hear one thing I've been thinking about quite a bit in the last a few weeks is Barack Obama's statement that the U.S. faces an epistemological crisis, and that may be the sort of central crisis in the country, an inability to distinguish opinion from fact, and a privileging of opinion over fact, or a privileging of something completely made up by a demagogue over truth. And he sees the country, and I mean this not just in the US, like it's maybe not everywhere, but it's around. I think that's going to be a hard thing to get out of.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. To me, that's one of the most terrifying features of today's world, is this sort of post-truth place that we seem to find ourselves in. I mean, President Trump can say one thing on Monday and completely contradict it on Tuesday, and there's still a sort of, I guess, with some percentage of the American populace, there's such fervor around him that there's some way to somehow for them to reconcile these two very conflicting, potentially neither of them true statements. And that's a terrifying thing. How do they begin to sort of heal their rifts if there's sort of this, a certain percentage of the population is living or seems content to live in a sort of post-truth place? I have no idea. I don't know.
An attachment to truth seems like an elitist position.
Yeah.
Tension.
Well, I think that's what the question about the meta-narrative was gesturing toward about 10 minutes ago, is that, one thing Barack Obama said recently is that, back in his childhood, he could remember how everyone more or less got their news from the same place. You would then adopt different perspectives on those basic shared facts, but you more or less shared the same relatively small number of facts about the way the world is. And he said, now even that first part of the epistemological moment is missing, right? So that even the initial facts aren't shared. Now, this actually gets, in some sense, at a question that's posed by Lyle McKenzie, who asks, what stories do you tell your children to help and support them in this time and to help them prepare for an uncertain future? Because surely part of the job of both parents, but also people who are writing literature, is to tell stories to convey meaning or to situate a child or a reader in a shared imagined world. So what kind of stories would you, because you have kids, and I wonder what kind of stories you're telling to help frame what's going on around them?
That's a good question. I mean, it's so instinctual and so in the moment that it's hard to kind of really quantify it and think about what it is that we're doing. It's something that happens gradually throughout your interactions with them. I'm trying to think. I think it was really important for us in the spring when all of this happened to try and really explain what the virus was in a way that wasn't completely terrifying. We kind of came at it with a caveat that children are mainly not getting sick, but it was really important to kind of walk them through a very rudimentary idea of what this illness was. We found that really alleviated a lot of the fears that they were having. I mean, there was probably a month when they both were just getting up all night long, like they just couldn't sleep. There's just this low-grade anxiety. And you really have to address this with children. You really have to they need that kind of bedrock of reassurance. And I think so often with children, we try and maybe sweep that away and just sort of prettify things and maybe, to tell little white lies. But I think that the way that anxieties are really confronted is by giving the true story, the full story of what it is that we're all going through, but just to do in a gentler way. I think having a bit of an understanding of what the virus was and how it sort of spread and what we had to, this was really empowering for them on some level. And so it's these kinds of, I guess, that's like a nonfiction story that you would tell your kid. And I guess in terms of fictional stories, I think, that the stories that we were sort of reading with them and telling to them, these didn't change. These were the stories that we would always have read to them and were reading to them and were sharing with them. And I think that too was something that was essentially comforting for them, is that while, we are going through so much that is so different, these stories that you've always enjoyed and that have been so important to you and that have really given you comfort all your life, that these stories are still here and we're still enjoying them and we're still reading them. And that made an immense difference, I think.
Mm. So I'm just noticing that we're about 5 minutes or so from the end of our time together. So this actually is an appropriate moment to ask this question. This is the final question, I think, from Brad Bui, who says, Essie, your novels have explored such dark eras, Nazi-occupied France and the era of slavery in the Americas. Do we need some distance from events to write about them and think about them clearly? Or how is it we write about a time that we're actually in? And can we have focus as writers on our own moment in history? So as we approach the end of our time together, I thought a question about time might be appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the writer, really. I'm somebody who seems to need to get some distance from a certain, I guess, event or moment in time in order to really understand it and parse it and feel like I can write about it in a meaningful way. Writing about now has been something I've been doing, but it's all been kind of nonfiction pieces, and I'm currently working on essays. And this is something that allows me to write about now. But in terms of my deeply imaginative work, and I say that just my fiction really is what I mean. I really have had such trouble confronting the now. But there are some writers who do this brilliantly. They're just so amazing about writing about, the current moment. And this is a skill that I just don't have. How about you, Tim? Do you find it? Are you like writing about, like in your poetry?
Yeah, I am. But mostly essays. I mean, I'm really preoccupied by this question. What spiritual resources might be needed now by people, and these spiritual resources also they have a kind of political wing attached to them. So I've been trying to write about that, and in the poetry as well. Yeah, fairly current. Yeah, but I'm also interested in eras where people seem to lose everything. I'm thinking of 6th century Greece and Plato's Academy. It was dissolved. And what did that feel like, to lose a whole thought world forever?
I think in a lot of ways, historical writing is a way of writing about the present, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But do you feel we're losing a whole thought world now? We're on the edge of losing a whole thought world, perhaps in a good way.
It feels like it. Certain things going that I hope are going that are wonderful to lose, but I think other things are going, and the whole business of people turning their backs on truth. Thinking that an attachment to truth is effete or elitist or pretentious. That's shocking. That's a major loss. Major loss.
You can have the final comment on this, and then we have to wrap up for real.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we are losing things that, along with things that, we sort of hope will change. There are these other potential losses, which are, egregious and kind of frightening. And what do you do with that? It's difficult to say, but I think in general, I have to believe, and I like to believe that that we're sort of working towards a more just place, and that though we will take some backward steps, and though we'll find ourselves in positions that feel, just completely unjust or bizarre, like this post-truth place that we find ourselves in, I like to think that we will eventually live past that and get beyond it and come back to a more balanced place.
Well, what a wonderful way to end. And I want, on behalf of the nearly 500 registrants for today, I want to thank you, Essie, for joining us, and thank Tim for stimulating such a rich conversation. And thanks to everyone for asking such great questions. So thank you. I wonder, Scott, if we could put up the poster for the next talks to give you some sense of what's coming up. So Thursday, January 7th, we have Miroslav Volf. And do we have the series poster available? I'm not sure we do. But if you get on our website, you'll see you'll see the time and link for Volf, for Noam Chomsky, for Linda Woodhead, and for Thomas Homer Dixon. And the way this is going to work is that toward the end of March, all 5 of them are going to come back together for a conversation among the 5 authors and activists and intellectuals. And so I think that's going to be a really rich conversation. So we hope to see as many of you as possible for that broader conversation. So thanks again to Essie and Tim. And thanks also, I want to make sure I observe that Ian Alexander, who is my colleague at the diocese, he and I have worked very closely on this series, as well as Scott Dolph from the CSRS. And I really want to thank those 2 guys, especially for working together so well on all of what we've done in the last few months. Thanks also to Rachel Brown, Noriko Prizzo, and Tara Sharp for helping to promote and organize today's event. So we look forward to seeing many of you in January 7th, for our first lecture back after the break. Take care, everybody. Have a good evening, and I'll see you later. Bye.